This is Don Norton in the Gold Coast Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's the 14th of September, 1992. This is side one, tape one, side one, and I'm with Ambers E Hanson, Hanson, who served in the 34th Bomb Group during World War II. You go by Ambers, is that right?
That's correct.
Tell me how you got into the military. Where were you? What were you doing? How did it all come about?
Well, Don, like most young fellows back in those days, I think we came from all over the country and from various backgrounds, just like Americans do today. But I was a country boy.
From? Came
in off the farm from Alabama in Cleburne County.
How do you spell that?
Cleburne.
Just out of curiosity, I'm a farm boy. What were your money crops?
We had cotton and corn and soybeans, mostly cotton and corn back in those days.
Yeah. You were in high school?
In high school, and in my senior year, I volunteered for the Air Force.
Why the Air Force?
I had a brother-in-law and also a brother, just older than me, that were already in the Air Force. So that was, I knew a little bit about the Air Force, and certainly I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly.
Had you been into that model airplane or following airplanes around? Had you done any of that? How did you get an interest in flying?
Very little. Very little of that was in my background at that time. Just the fact that I had visited my brother-in-law at his military air base in Atlanta, and I had been in and out of airplanes and just thought they were fascinating.
Did you finish high school?
I liked about 3 months finishing high school.
I understand.
At that time, after the war, I went back to high school and finished and then went on to
Now, some said that they gave you your degrees anyway if they drafted you. I guess if they drafted you out of high school.
I went back to high school as soon as I got back home. And the principal, of course, welcomed me back in. And I stayed around and attended classes for a few days. And we talked, and I maybe took a test or two of some kind. I can't remember. But anyway, the principal suggested that I go on to college.
And you did?
I did.
You went to college where?
I first went to West Georgia College in Carrollton, Georgia.
Carrollton?
Right. Carrollton. West Georgia College. Stayed there about a year, kind of got my feet on the ground, so to speak. And
you still single?
At that time, yes. Mm-hmm. Right.
Then?
After that, I went to, transferred to Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama, and graduated from there.
With a degree in?
Agricultural economics and agricultural science.
What did you do for a living after you left college?
I worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Service.
Your entire life?
Yeah. Right.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
You've lived where then?
First went to work for the Soil Conservation Service in North Alabama. Stayed there about 3 or 4 years and transferred back to our state headquarters in Auburn. Stayed there for several years and then went to school in North Carolina State University.
An advanced degree?
Right.
In?
Economics.
You got a master's, doctorate?
I didn't finish the master's program.
I see.
I had a wife and kids and career responsibilities.
And you took a career where then?
I stayed with the Soil Conservation Service and spent about 3 years in New Mexico, and then later on short periods of time in the southeastern states, various states.
Okay.
Most of my time was in New Mexico and Alabama.
Okay, you left. You joined the Army Air Corps then.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, I joined on December the 9th, 1942. I believe that's right.
You had just turned 18?
I was 19.
Oh, you were 19.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And then what happened to you after? Where did you join?
It at a base in Anniston, Alabama.
What town?
Anniston.
How do you spell it?
Anniston.
Now, why that base?
That was just an assembly point for everybody that was going into the military, whether it was ground forces, Air Force, or Navy.
Now, you actually enlisted there?
Yeah.
I see. And
Yeah.
what happened to you?
Spent, just a few days there. They put us on a train and sent us to Atlanta. And there we gave up our civilian clothes and packed them in a bag and sent them back to our homes. They gave us olive drab military type and stayed there for a few days. They put us on a train, sent us to Biloxi, Mississippi, air base at the Biloxi, Mississippi.
Keesler.
For
Was it Keesler then?
Keesler for a few weeks of basic training and interviews and tests and so forth.
Now, I have a question. When they sent your bags back home, did the post office provide that, or how did that little system work when you sent your civvies back home? Do you remember?
I don't remember, except all I had to do was just provide them with a name and address of my parents.
And the clothes.
Right, and
They took care of
yeah.
it.
Yeah. As far as I know, the military, whatever cost was involved, the military paid it, or the post office did it for free. I don't know.
Tell me about basic. How'd that go?
Basic was kind of rough. One of the major things, not the physical part of it maybe, but just the fact that you're thrown into with a group of other young fellows at that time, and you don't know them, they don't know you, and you don't know what you're supposed to do or what you're not supposed to do, and so that was frustrating.
Well, I thought you were told everything to do and not to do.
We were. We were. But still, that was frustrating. But after basic training...
Do you remember any memorable stories from basic? Drill sergeants? Funny incidents?
I remember, I guess a lot of things stand out in people's minds, but when they're kind of shocked and being mistreated a little bit, it stands out more than some other things. One of the things that I was totally unaccustomed to was being confronted by my drill corporal, I believe, who wanted to borrow some money. And so he, after a couple of days, we talked a little, and he needed $20. I let him have $20, and the next day I was on shipping orders to be shipped out, and I never got my $20.
Was there any relation?
No.
He pressured you, or
he was
intimidated you, or
intimidating, I suppose, because he was my drill corporal, and
what did he say he needed it for?
Oh, he's just always broke, as soldiers were.
What other kinds of abuse did you suffer?
Well, I guess not physical. I guess it was just mental sort of things. Standing in line, waiting. I guess it was also, I felt intimidated greatly by having to undress completely and put on a raincoat and get out with the crew and walk to the medical building for physical examination. I thought that was strange.
You really were a little farm boy, weren't you?
Yes, indeed.
This must have been a completely new experience.
Right.
Were you riding home at that time?
Oh, yes.
What were you saying to your family?
I probably didn't say very much of the details to my parents about this. Generally, you know, I was homesick, lonely, like everybody else was. And so I probably inquired about how all the friends and neighbors were doing.
Did you have any second thoughts about enlisting?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Now, you'd have been drafted anyway, wouldn't you?
Right. I would have been drafted, but yes, I had, after I'd been gone for 2 or 3 weeks, I would have given my right arm to be back home again. But of course I knew that was impossible, and I had made a commitment, and I had to follow through with it.
How well off were your parents? Was your father as a farmer? Was he surviving, or did he have depression problems?
Oh, we all had depression problems back in those days. Yeah.
He didn't lose the farm, though.
No. We managed to hang on. We were all, looking back on it, Don, we were all in poverty. And considerable number of people who lived in the rural areas of the South in those days, we were all in poverty. We didn't know it at the time, but looking back on it, I can recognize.
That's such a frequent comment people make. Some people have suggested, and I've thought, that Americans might not have tolerated the deprivations of the war had they not just been through a depression. Have you ever thought about that?
Not in those terms, I don't think, but I think there was a bond between people then.
Interesting.
That just, you know, we all had to help each other, and we all worked together. And so I think that sort of thing, that concept carried through to our military work and the thing that we had to do in order to maintain or to keep our freedom.
After basic, where did you go after basic?
I went to...
well, you said you had a lot of tests at basic, or no, that was next?
I had a lot of tests there, and I was selected.
In basic?
Yeah.
And you were selected?
I was selected to attend a radio operator school in Illinois.
Do you have any idea why you tested in that direction?
No, unless I had I probably showed some ability to, with rhythm or musical tones, something like that.
Some of the testing involved that, I gather.
Yeah, yeah.
Had you been a musician in high school?
No.
Or, no, you just...
No.
You had a good ear.
I suppose I had a good ear.
Okay. Illinois.
I went to radio operator school there, and we got there in the cold of December or January.
More shock.
More shock. There was snow, and there was cold, and there was walking in the cold weather and exercising and taking physical training, marching and so forth, even there with the radio operator school. But we stayed there, I believe, about 3 months.
What do you remember about school there, about the school itself?
I was, again, I was overwhelmed, I think, by what I had to learn. And this bothered me quite a bit. But
was it just the bulk of it, or the technical, or the
both the bulk of it and the technicalities of radio and electronics that was just completely new to me.
How'd you do?
I did okay. I managed to get through, hang on, and do the best I could.
What were some of the technical challenges?
Well, I think some of the technical things that we had to learn about just the basics of electricity, I thought looking back on it, I think it was probably unnecessary. But the definition of an ohm, that floored me, you know, and various other things like that relating to electricity.
That's the unit of resistance, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
I think. But then the International Morse Code was what we studied and learned, and how to read it, record it, how to pick it up on your ear and write it down quickly and so forth.
Now, I understand you had to achieve a certain degree of proficiency.
I believe it was 16 to 18 words per minute.
I see.
And that's what most of us accomplished. A few in the class probably who had musical training especially, and also typing in high school. A few of those fellows were able to pick it up a little faster and take the code a little faster.
Did you have to learn how to type?
No. No, I wrote longhand.
What other technical challenges?
Well,
Describe a typical day of training.
well, we would get up, we would be called out early in the morning about daylight for exercising calisthenics. And then after that, we went back in the barracks, we went to breakfast. And after breakfast, we came back to the barracks and made our bed, cleaned up, and we had to fall out again in the formation and go to the building where classes were held.
March.
March, run. Yeah.
And you went to classes till?
I suppose from 8 in the morning until sometime 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Yeah. And then after that, of course, we had to go back to our barracks, clean up, make sure everything was in good order. And
When did you get lunch?
oh, about midday, we'd take a break for lunch, fall out of our classrooms into formation, march to the mess hall, stand in line and wait for lunch, and then after that you fall back in formation and you're marched back to your classroom.
Have you ever thought much?
Very tightly controlled.
Have you ever thought much about the propriety, the utility of all this formation marching drill? Did it accomplish the purpose that?
I think there's probably some argument on both sides, Don, but for what we had to accomplish then, I think it was probably the best thing, because we had to know that we had to be disciplined and controlled in order for somebody, the officers higher up, to direct us. Then we had to follow those directions precisely, and so to accomplish that, I think that was
interesting. What memorable things from radio school? Any stories or humorous incidents?
I can't remember. No, I don't remember anything.
Sounds pretty routine.
Yeah, very routine.
From Illinois.
From Illinois, we went to gunnery school. This was, you see, we had to be dual responsibilities once we got to the point where we could fly. We had to be a radio operator first and a gunner, machine gunner, second. So we had to go to, all radio operators had to go to gunnery school, where they learned to use the 45 caliber pistol, the 30 caliber machine gun, and the 50 caliber machine gun.
Now, where was this?
This was in, would you believe, Las Vegas, Nevada. Right.
It was either there or Kingman, Arizona.
Right. And I've always wondered, it would be interesting to me now if I could go to the little spot on the ground where that air base was, and I have no idea where it might have been, but it was somewhere right around close to town here.
Of course, Las Vegas was a little different then.
Las Vegas was quite different from Illinois. So when we got here, it was in the summertime. Very hot, very dry.
Dry.
And this was a total shock to most of us. But we went to gunnery school, and again, a lot of classroom instructions with how to take the machine guns apart. And of course, a lot of safety precautions we had to learn. And we went out we were loaded into trucks and went out in the desert here and for gunnery and machine gun practice, firing practice, out on the range. And we had to qualify for the pistol and that was the 45, and the 30 caliber machine gun, the 50 caliber machine gun.
What do you remember most about the gunnery training?
This was the first time that I was able to get in an airplane and fly.
Oh, they actually flew you on your training?
Yeah. This was toward the end of our gunnery training. We would, several of us get into an airplane. The machine guns were mounted on the rear windows, and there was a drone plane out there somewhere pulling this big white sock, and it was pulled a mile or something maybe behind the airplane, and we were supposed to fire at that big white sock flying behind that airplane. And we had tracer bullets in our machine gun, so we could tell fairly well where we were accurate or not.
Now, some people talk about having each person's ammunition color coded.
No.
You were using tracers.
We were using tracers, yeah. There was no color coding that I know of in our ammunition.
Yeah, they used to paint the ammunition, and when it would go through the sock, you could tell who hit. You didn't have that.
I don't remember
Now,
that.
this is the first interesting. It's the first tracer story I think I've heard.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, I don't remember that. No.
How'd you do?
Oh, I did okay. And another thing we did that I thought was kind of interesting, we would ride in the back of a pickup truck. And
this story.
You've heard this one probably.
Go ahead.
There was a gun mounted in the back of this pickup truck, and we would stand back there we were secured so that we didn't fall out. The truck would go around curvy driveways and so forth, and we were supposed to fire at various objects as we were going in this direction versus then going in another direction. It was to teach us to lead the target one way or the other.
Had you done any shooting as a boy?
Oh, yes, I've done.
What kind of guns did you use?
We used rifles and shotguns.
22 rifles and shotguns. So guns were not new to you?
No.
Yeah.
No.
What else do you remember about Las Vegas?
I remember I remember that I believe this was along toward the end of almost at graduation time, just before we were awarded our wings. We were all loaded into trucks. These were big 6x6 open trucks out at the air base here, and we were brought into town for a Saturday night visit. And that was the first time I had seen Las Vegas. And back in those dusty days, at least I think they were dusty days.
They were.
And we roamed around town, and still, even in those days, there were bright lights here, and that was fascinating to an old country boy.
What was the town like then? Was it a lot of gambling even then?
I don't recall that there was a lot of gambling at that time, but I'm sure there must have been.
What was Las Vegas known for?
Oh, I suppose in those days it was known for its openness in drinking and the bar rooms and that sort of thing.
Shock.
Oh, absolutely. Total cultural shock.
What precisely was the shocking?
I suppose it was the just total difference of anything I had ever been exposed to before in my life. And precisely I suppose it was some kind of social shock more than anything else.
You grew up in a religious family?
Yeah.
Baptist, I presume?
Right.
Southern Baptist?
Right.
Your parents were churchgoers?
Yes. Right. So here I am thrown out into a totally different world. But of course, everybody else was in the same boat, looking back on it.
How about the morals and the profanity and so on of the men you were with?
Sometimes I was shocked by the morals that I was exposed to from some of the other men, and profanity. Right, that was common.
No blacks in the units?
No.
That reunion that we passed there, the man that was sitting there, he was Army Air Corps. He was a mechanic.
Oh, really?
I'd love to interview him, but he just has no time at all. But
I wonder if he was at Tuskegee Air Base in Alabama.
I'll ask him.
Ask him that. That might...
Tuskegee,
Moulton, Moulton Field,
Ulton.
Yeah. Moulton Field in Tuskegee, Alabama.
TUS?
Oh, TUSKEE something.
That's close enough.
Close enough.
You also thought of something else from Las Vegas.
Yes, but now I can't remember what it was.
You said first this and there was something else.
Yes, I lost my whatever it was I was going to tell.
It doesn't matter what order you put it in, so if it comes back to you, bring it up again.
Okay.
Now, this was the summer in Las Vegas?
Right.
Well, you had air conditioning, of course, in your barracks.
We never heard of air conditioning.
Well, how did you tolerate the...
All the doors were open, all the windows were open, and there were no fans. I don't remember any fans. Just total, complete exposure to the elements. Of course, the only weather element that time was high temperature, a lot of sunshine, and dry winds. One other thing I remember that it comes back to me now. The swimming pool here on the air base when I was taking gunnery school. To me, that was beautiful. There was this nice, clean water. And I was an old country boy. I used to swim in the creek, There was this nice, clean pool, and some of the men could swim well with graceful motions and so forth. Some of them were good divers. And I would look at those guys, and I would swim a little, and I thought, gosh, I wish I could dive off that high board up there. And that challenged me and went through my mind for several weeks. I finally got up enough courage to get up on that high board and make that dive into the water. It was an accomplishment for me that I really wanted to do.
You were really a country boy.
and I wanted to do that. Well, I did. But it was very ungraceful. And I hit the water very hard. And I almost lost my breath. And I came out, I swam out to the edge and shook myself a little bit, I guess, and climbed out. And I thought, boy, I'll never do that again.
So, you didn't?
No, I didn't.
You'd been diving off the low board.
Right.
But
yeah.
That's a marvelous detail.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
So, little things like that I remember.
From Las Vegas?
From Las Vegas, I went to El Paso, Texas, and started training with a crew there.
Oh, they formed a crew?
You see, I'd finished radio operator school, I'd finished gunnery school, and all of the basics that went along with that. So then it was time to be assembled into a flying crew. And so that was done at El Paso, Biggs Air Force Base, the Biggs Field. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we flew there and trained there as a crew for, maybe 2 or 3 months, I'm not sure.
The B-24s?
B-24s. And one day, I wanted to become a pilot. I wanted to fly. So I had taken some tests to see if I could qualify for that. So one day, I had to leave the Air Force, leave the air base, and go. I had to go to some another military base close by for some kind of special examination. And while I was gone, and I think that was most of the day, while I was gone, my remaining crew flew while I was away. They needed a radio operator, so they had to call one from somewhere else to get one to fly with them. When I got back to my base, my barracks, I was informed by some of the other fellows there in the barracks that my crew had crashed, and several of them were killed. And that was quite a shock. So,
now, why had you been called away for the day?
I had been called away to take some test, examination type, paper type and physical type, as I recall. And that was the reason I was away. I was trying to qualify for the cadet program.
Cadet program.
Right.
What had happened in the crash?
I believe the pilot was killed. I know the pilot was killed. 2 or 3 of the other crew members were killed, and the radio operator was badly, he was in terrible shape. He was all bound up with, I think he was burned during the crash.
What had caused the crash, do you know?
No, I don't know. Some kind of course, malfunction in the engines, I suppose, but I don't really know.
Had you been a praying boy?
Oh yes, somewhat, yeah, and that occurred to me, yeah.
So you were reformed into another crew, or what?
Right. Then, of course, I was reformed into another crew in Pueblo, Colorado.
Or you were sent away from El Paso.
Right. You see, my crew had been killed, and what was left of us, there was 2 or 3 of us left. We were then just so-called free agents for a while until we could get into another crew.
How much had you bonded as a crew during those 2 or 3 months?
Oh, there was considerable friendship among us. We helped each other. We kind of stayed together, and that sort of thing certainly got stronger as we went on through the war.
Now, in Pueblo, you had a new crew.
I had a new crew, and we went through the training again.
B-24s?
B-24s, yeah. I remember getting airsick. Oh, it was terrible. I would fly, and it was I would get sick, and I would look down at the ground, which would be probably 10 to 12,000 feet down there, and I remember having the feeling that I wish this thing would just crash. Terrible sickness. That was kind of unusual.
Now, some men say that if they were sick so many times, this was later in the war, they were washed out if they got sick twice in a row. Was there any ruling of that sort?
Oh, no. Not that I knew of. No.
So you'd have been in Colorado about when?
This would have been, I guess, in 1944, 43, part to 43 and 44. Yeah.
What do you remember about your crew training in Colorado?
Well, things got a little better there, we became more proficient in what we were supposed to do. That eased the tension somewhat, and we became a closer crew. But one thing that happened there was that, of course, all of us were more or less amateurs at what we were doing. That included the pilot and everybody else. So we were flying one day along toward nearly halfway through the program, I guess, and we had been on a gunnery mission and bombing mission somewhere around in the desert here. There was a bombing range and gunnery range. And we got back to our Pueblo base, and for some reason, I don't know, maybe the airfield was crowded with landings or some other reason. We left Pueblo for a few minutes and went back towards Denver somewhere and made another turn for probably 15, 20 minutes. And on the final approach to the airbase, to our landing strip, something went wrong. The engine, first one stopped, and then another one stopped, and this was the 4-engine B-24. The engine stopped, and we just were not going to make it back to the end of the runway. So we crashed in the desert out here, not far from here.
Not far from, are you in Denver, you mean? Or are you flying out over Colorado?
I'm sorry, I'm in Pueblo at this time.
Tell me about the crash.
Well, there was just a very little warning that we had because we were coming in for what we thought was a normal landing. And
everybody had to be strapped in
and... no. Some of us in the back of the plane were not strapped in. We should have been, but we were coming in for a landing, and first one engine failed, and then a few seconds later another engine failed, and a few seconds after that all 4 of them failed, and we were on the final approach, and we just didn't make it to the end of the runway. So there was we bounced into the desert.
The landing wheels?
The wheels were...
Landing gear down?
No, we came in wheels up. And I think that was probably an error. But anyway, we knew just a few seconds before we hit the ground, we were standing around back in the back. And we realized that something terrible was wrong and we were not going to make it. I sat down against the bulkhead and pulled my arms up like this and pulled my knees up as close to my chest as I could.
Now, you've been trained to do that.
Yes. And so we bounced onto the ground. There was a terrible shock of dust and dirt and a bounce. We bounced again and then came to a stop shortly after that in a tremendous cloud of dust and dirt and so forth. And we were... all the crew members, our uniform, our face, our head was completely covered with dust. And we had trouble seeing out. One fellow one or two of us jumped out the window, and another one was standing in the window, and he says, I'm blind, I can't see. And because he had so much dirt and dust in his eyes, we encouraged him and told him to jump, and he did. And so then we took hold of him, and we all ran out across the desert, trying to get away from the airplane.
Nobody injured?
Only minor injuries to several of us.
You were fortunate.
Yeah, very fortunate.
Did they ever know what had caused the failures?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Go ahead.
We ran out of gas. Absolutely. That short trip of 15 minutes or so back, we actually ran out of gas, and I believe there was probably an error on the amount of fuel that we had consumed and also probably an error in the indicated amount that we had left.
Is the engineer in charge of that?
Flight engineer, right.
Did you ever talk to him about it?
Yeah, he was talked to considerably by other people, and yes, we think there was an error there. We don't know precisely how it came about.
There was no action taken against him or the pilots or anything?
No.
So when did you start flying again?
Oh, after a few days. Didn't take long.
You must have been terrified, though.
It was, absolutely. We feared for our lives every day.
For a while.
Yeah, right.
As you walked away from the plane, what was the reaction of the men as you got away and gathered?
We just kind of, I guess, in our shock, we looked at each other, and I could look at one of the other crew members, and he looked like a ghost that was covered in dirt. And of course, I didn't realize I looked the same way to him. So
the dust had come up into the plane.
Right.
Had opened up the fuselage, and
right.
Pilots were not injured.
Only I had I sprung my wrist, and I believe my knee a little. The engineer had a little bump or stitch or two on his head. The injuries were very minor.
Did you bounce around in there, or did you kind of stay up against the bunk?
Well, I must have bounced around a little bit, yeah. Right.
So you're back flying a little while later?
Right.
How far were you from the runway, by the way? Were you a mile, half
I think
mile?
we were about a mile, 1 or 2 miles, something like that,
see.
from the runway. Yeah. Yeah, we reformed in a few days, and I guess shook ourselves off and went back to it.
Is there much talk on the base, what had happened?
Oh, yes. Right. Most of it was light, how lucky you are and that sort of thing.
You were?
Yes, we were lucky. Right.
Do you remember any other crashes while you were there?
Crashes it seemed to me they were quite frequent. We lost planes down in El Paso. I remember seeing them, one crash against the mountain, and there was tremendous fire and smoke. And
Nobody survived that.
No. And then here at Pueblo, there were other crashes, yeah. Some people would survive most of the crashes, but on the other hand, there'd be several of them get killed.
Did the B-24 have a reputation for being safe, dangerous?
Well, we thought that it did have that sort of... We felt that it didn't have the right kind of wing.
Was that the small winged one?
Yeah, it was a small, relatively narrow wing, but yet it was very long, stretched out from the side of the plane. But yet then the big belly of the aircraft, the fuselage, was... and we had so much weight that it just seemed to me that... and it was talked, that it just wasn't the right thing.
Was that the one they called the flying coffin?
It could have been. I'm not sure.
I think maybe that was it. Now the
probably
B-26 was called the flying prostitute. Do you remember that?
Yeah, right.
No visible means of support.
Yeah.
That was the B-26. But the B-24, I think, was called the flying coffin.
I think that's right. Yeah. So...
But it carried a bigger bomb load than the 17, I guess was its advantage. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. It had a big bomb bay.
Yeah. Now, you went from... did you go overseas from...
We went from there to... from Pueblo, we went overseas to England. We went to New Jersey, and there we were loaded on the Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, you drove over.
Yeah, right. We drove over on the Queen Elizabeth. And there again, that was quite a shock and quite an experience to go into this beautiful, what was the beautiful and luxurious Queen Elizabeth, and you go down in the belly of it, and you find that everything has been ripped out except the walls. And then they have bunks and beds hanging on the walls. And after 3 or 4 days out at sea, I just felt like I needed to take a bath. So I ran water in the tub, and I got in, and I tried to soap up, and it was salt water. So the bath turned out to be a total failure.
That was about a 5-day trip, wasn't it?
5 or 6.
Did you get up on deck, or?
Oh, yes. Every day.
Every day.
At a certain time, we were allowed to go up on deck and walk around, look around, take exercises. But, of course, the ship was very crowded.
Food?
Food was adequate, you know. It was strictly military, but it was adequate.
You landed where?
In Scotland, I believe. Oh, let me think.
Were the seas dangerous by this time still?
We were not aware of much of that, especially being on the Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
We never noticed much of that. Maybe one day there was a little roughness, but that's all.
No, I mean danger from the Germans.
Not a great deal of danger that we felt, because the Queen had such speed and maneuverability that we were relatively safe from submarines and so forth.
Scotland to where?
To Mendlesham Air Base.
Well,
Right.
that's the men I talked to last night were at Mendlesham.
Right. That's right. 34th Bomb Group.
Yeah, of course. Everybody was there.
Was at Mendlesham, and that's where we did our combat flying from. You
practiced a little while?
We practiced and transferred over and were checked out in flying the B-17. And that didn't take but a few days. And of course there was a tremendous need for us. So the checkout procedures and time was probably cut a little short.
2 questions. Any culture shock in arriving in England?
Of course there's the cultural shock of language. They didn't speak English according to our definition. But, and of course there was the tremendously thick fog. In midday, we had to take either a flashlight or a lantern to find our way to the mess hall and then back to our barracks. That was our first 2 or 3 days in England, and that was quite a shock. After that, I don't recall that we had fog that long and that thick.
Now, compare the 24 to the 17. From your own personal...
We felt safer in the B-17 and
the Fortress.
The Flying Fortress, and it was a great airplane, still is. And the bomb load was probably a little bit less, but I think that increased our safety margin a little.
Now, what does the radio man do? Describe his duty. Let's take you on a mission. What does the radio man do?
The radio operator is responsible for maintaining communications with the home base, not between plane and plane in the formation.
That's an intercom.
That's right. Yeah. In the lead aircraft was the radio operator who maintained that radio contact.
Did you ever fly lead?
No. I never flew lead.
Okay, he maintained contact with the base.
Right. And all the other operators stood by, listened in for communications, and stood ready to take over. And if we were damaged or shot down or something, then we were then allowed to initiate communications on our own.
To the home base?
To the home base or anywhere else that might. Since this would be an emergency transmission, it was open to anybody. But most likely it was to the home base. Yeah.
So really, other than listening, did you have much activity?
Not in communications, no. I would, when we were flying combat missions, when we would be attacked by the German fighters, I went back to my position as a gunner and used one of the guns.
You were waist
gunner.
Waist gunner.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, your communications, were they in Morse code? Or were they voice?
Yes. They, most of the communications was coded. That would be the lead radio operator. His messages back to his home base would be in International Morse code. And of course, there was a secret code that we used for every mission. It would change from one mission to another.
How did that change? How was that code? How did they code Morse code?
Of course, the alphabet was used, and the various numbers were used. One day they would mean one thing, and then the next day they would mean something else.
And how did you know what?
We had a sheet of paper about this size, enclosed in plastic, and it was confidential, and it was my job to be responsible for that particular mission.
Now, when you say you listened in, that means you got signals in Morse code.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how did you
and
know
I would record those
letters
in in units of 5. I would write down the letter that I received. If it was an A or a D or an X, I would write that down. And then I would then take my confidential coded sheet and see what that A is supposed to mean today.
Now, this was a fairly simple code, but it was adequate for the day, I gather.
Right. And of course, I'm sure the Germans were always able to break our code. Given a little time, they could do that.
What kinds of transmissions went back and forth between the lead plane and the base?
Most of the time, I think it was whether or not we were in formation, whether or not we were encountering enemy fighters, and to what degree we were receiving flak from the ground, and weather conditions as to whether we were going to stay on our primary target or or to take an alternate target.
Now, these transmissions were at different frequencies, and these were all set beforehand, so because there were thousands of planes in the air.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So essentially, your job was rather passive as long as you were not in combat.
Right.
Now, what technical expertise did you need to have besides the knowledge of the code, the Morse code, and then the code of the day? What?
I was supposed to know something about at least the mechanics of the radio equipment that I had. If I tried to manipulate my equipment, if it didn't work, I was supposed to know some of the technicalities of how to fix it.
Did you ever have that?
Yes. Oh yeah.
What kinds of problems?
Most of the time, it was a fuse blown or something like that.
Well, now spare parts.
We had some spare parts along. Right. Tubes.
Tubes. By that you mean?
Radio tubes.
Oh, tubes. You say?
Yeah. Right. That was when we had radios had tubes.
Oh yes. Now these were checked out carefully, I gather, when you got back to the base. Somebody went through the radios, but not you.
No, there was a mechanic on the ground waiting for us to tell him whether or not we had mechanical problems with the equipment. If so, then he would take care of it and fix it. We didn't have to do that as radio operators.
Tell me about your first mission.
Oh gosh, I don't think I even remember the first mission.
What's the first mission you remember? How
Well,
many did you do altogether?
We did 25.
25 missions.
Yeah.
And these were essentially where?
To Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and France.
Tell me about the first one. You do
I
have some
remember-
sensations on your first.
I remember that we were all frightened very much, and we were shocked, of course, when we would look out the plane and see these big black puffs exploding around us. That was probably a 155 millimeter cannon fire from the ground, and that was quite a shock. I remember, I guess the first mission we went to Berlin, that I think this might have been our third flight, combat flight. We went to Berlin and we were shot up a little bit. We lost an engine, but we managed to stay in formation and make it back to the base.
Your feelings?
Oh, quite frightened, and of course thankful that we made it back.
Well,
We had a few holes in the plane made by flak or bullets, I don't know which.
Everybody says they were scared silly from the moment they hit the flak till they got back over the channel.
Oh yes, we were. We were.
How do you
very
handle that? Or were you frightened during the? Some say that.
You live from 1 minute to the next. Everything is fine, and right now everything is okay, but then the flak starts flying around you, and I think you just kind of react involuntarily to that. You just do what you have to do. If you're firing a gun, you fire it. If you're trying to protect yourself, if there are no fighters around, you try to protect yourself with whatever equipment might be on the plane. Even a box, you might hold it to your side or to your chest, ammunition box. Or, of course, we had on flak vest, but the rest of our body was exposed.
Did you encounter much enemy aircraft, fighter aircraft?
Quite a bit. Oh yes.
Did you do some shooting yourself?
Yes, right. We did. Right.
Now, how effective was that?
I think most of it was a lot of luck, because we're flying and we're using evasive action. The plane is trying to do this a little bit, and within a split second, an enemy aircraft comes through your formation, and you quickly, as you can, you try to fire a few shots, and most of it, I think, is just kind of luck. But if you got several planes in a formation and they're all concentrating on trying to shoot down one or two airplanes, well, then just a matter of statistics, I guess, and odds would occasionally shoot one of them down.
Did you see any enemy aircraft go down?
Oh yes, right, in fire and smoke and twirling motion going down.
I've talked to very few men who had any confirmed kills, very few gunners.
Oh yes, I don't recall that any gunner ever got credit for shooting one down.
I interviewed a man a couple of weeks ago who got one of the first Me-262s, the
Is that
German
right?
jet. He ran out of gas right at the top.
Oh,
He was
and
sitting
it
right out
was a
there.
sitting duck, wasn't he?
Sitting duck.
Right, and just out there, just taking down.
He says he was close enough. He says he still remembers the terror on the man's face.
Yeah, yeah. I think we didn't encounter anything that dramatic, I don't believe.
24 missions. Any of them stand out?
25.
25. Any of them stand out?
Only the 2 or 3 where we got hit by enemy fire.
Flak.
And we'd flak, mostly, I'm sure. One I remember along towards the end of our mission, our stay over there, we went to somewhere in southern France, and it was supposed to be a milk run, fairly easy flight, and no or limited opposition. But we were surprised. We went in at about 10,000 feet, and that was relatively low because we thought it was going to be an easy bombing mission. We were completely shocked by the enemy ground fire, and we were so close down we could see the fire coming out of the ends of the guns, and then the flak bursting all around us, black smoke, and that was quite a shock too. To look down into the barrel of this gun and it's firing, you see the fire coming out the end of it.
How large were the formations you typically went in?
I would guess, and this is just a guess, anywhere from 15 to 30 maybe.
Oh, only that many airplanes at a time?
Out of our group. We might join another group and another group and another group. But then, of course, by the time you take all of these different groups from different air bases scattered around England, they all got up there, then there would be several hundred of them.
Did you see many 17s go down?
A few. And by that I mean probably a half a dozen or so that I saw myself.
So you were bombing from when till when?
From December of 44 until June of 45.
So you were toward the end.
Right.
Did the 34th group, they had bombed, how long had they been in existence over there?
I think they must have been there for 3 years.
So some of the early men really...
Some of the early men had stayed longer, flew more missions than we had to fly. Yeah.
How do the men stand up under pressure like that? Stress, flying.
Well, I guess we got a tremendous support from each other. We did things for each other. We tried to help each other get through the stress of the problems and tremendous demand of flying and trying to be alert and do our jobs.
Any others of your crew here at this week?
One other.
What's his name?
Verbal L. Holcomb.
V-E-R...
B-A-L.
B-A-L. What's the other?
Yeah, initial L. Holcomb. H-O-L-C-O-M-B.
You going to see him?
Oh, yes. He was the fellow we talked to down in the hallway. He had to go to a board meeting.
Oh, he's in the board
He's
meeting.
on the board of directors.
So I need to get a hold of him this evening, perhaps, or...
Well, if you could.
Can you do some arm twisting for me there?
If we have time. He would be willing to do it if we have time.
Yeah. That is the question.
That's the question.
What was he on the plane?
He was a tail gunner.
Oh, the tail gun. I love tail gunners. They got a real view of the war.
Yeah, right.
So he'll be coming out of that board meeting about noon then, won't he?
Right, about, yeah.
He was standing there when I was talking to you, as I recall.
Right, and our wives, yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
What other things stand out in your mind as you review the missions themselves?
We kept counting. This was one. We made it through this one. And in the same barracks, there was another crew who had made it through 5 or 6. Okay, a day or two later, this was number 2. And so we made it one by one. And we kept thinking that, our luck is holding out. We might make it.
What was your
Of course
quota
we
then?
did.
What was the quota then?
25.
Oh, you finished?
Yes.
Oh my
Right.
gosh.
Right.
You did them all.
Well, I did them all. Right.
How about the last ones as you're counting down?
We kind of, you kind of hold your breath, very much so, your own pins and needles. And you make it back on that last one, and there was quite a celebration, I guess.
I guess you got to buzz the tower or something too. I have a picture of someone.
I don't recall that, but by this time we're so-called experts, and so we were we might have flown, we might have done that. But I don't recall specifically doing
There
that.
was a club that some of the bases used to talk about, the Lucky Bastard Club.
Right.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
Were you initiated into that, or you were just...
I guess not officially. I don't believe.
No, I don't think it was anything official.
No. But yes, I suppose after one or two missions you were considered a lucky bastard to have made it that far. And
It was at the end of all your missions, that's when you really became...
you were really right. You had arrived.
You really had arrived.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else about the missions you'd like to...
I remember the debriefings after the missions. I'm sure you've had this described to you before, but we were all called into a room, and some of the debriefing questions were more or less routine. Only if we had something specifically to report was it very important. And that was also a time of laughing and talking and congratulating each other having made another mission. And then there was always over on the side table somewhere, there was a few bottles sitting around, and
shot of whiskey.
And we were given a shot of whiskey, and that helped to relieve the tension and increase the communications with other crew members.
You came home then, after 25?
The war was over, and
when did you do your last mission?
I don't remember specifically.
Was it toward the end of the war?
Yeah, oh yes, it was just before the end. Actually, Don, after we had flown our last mission, we still did some more flying. We flew some, what do you call, food missions.
Food drops into the Netherlands?
Right. We did some of that. Mm-hmm. So, actually, doing those we didn't have enemy opposition, but there was still considerable hazard just to do those.
Just the flying.
Right.
Did you fly the same 17 most of the time, or did you rotate? Oh,
Right.
you did?
Yeah.
What was the name of your plane?
Battlin' Butch.
Battlin apostrophe, Butch?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any nose art?
That, I'm sure we did, but I can't remember specifically what it was.
Who painted that on, or was it on there when you got there?
Some of the ground crew.
Oh.
Yeah. The ground crew was always there waiting for us when we came down. So they took charge of the plane. They did the maintenance and painting and refueling and repairs and so forth.
Now, on what circumstances did you leave England?
The war was over.
Oh, I see.
And so we were...
Could you summarize briefly what happened from there till you were discharged?
We gathered all of our equipment together, left most of it in bags, and we...
Personal equipment or airplane equipment?
Personal equipment. Parachutes, clothes that we could not bring back, heavy flying suits, and so forth. Flying boots, a lot of things like that. We went one morning to take our plane, and we started back home. We flew from there, from Mendlesham to some little place in Scotland, Ireland, I believe, and from there to Greenland, and from there to Labrador, Canada, and down the St. Lawrence to a place in Connecticut. And that took, I believe, about 3 days.
Was there the anticipation that you would go to the Pacific after a leave?
Oh, yes, indeed. Right. Our crew, when we left, when we all got to Connecticut, the crew was dispersed. We all went our separate ways, and then we all anticipated that we would be reformed into some other crew. We would never see each other again.
Oh, that must have been a sad party.
It was. And we then, of course, anticipated a short stay at home, and then back and reassemble and retrained into a different kind of airplane, probably a B-29.
You didn't get that far, though.
No. in August of 45, I was in South Dakota, and the war was over in Japan, and so that changed everything. And from there, I went to Davis-Monthan in Tucson, Arizona.
Davis?
Monthan.
How do you
Davis
spell?
Monthan.
How do you spell Monthan? Is that a base?
Yes. Davis Monthan Air Force Base
I can
at
find
Tucson. Stayed there for a short time, I believe about a month, before all the paperwork and the logistics could be managed to send me home.
What was your reception when you went home to Alabama after Europe?
Well, very exciting and very tearful and thankful. And
How large a town did you live in near?
there was a farm down the road about a quarter of a mile, and that's the town I lived in.
Was there any celebration? Was there anything in the newspapers?
Oh, yes. You're right. We were close to a little small town of Heflin, Alabama.
Heflin?
Right. And there was some newspaper articles in the paper about all the boys who were coming back home at that time. My brother,
not coming back home.
Yes, and those not coming back. And my brother was there. He had just been discharged. My brother-in-law was there. He had just came back from the Pacific. And so it was more or less a small family reunion at that time.
As you think back on the whole experience, how do you assess it?
It was very exciting, very adventurous, frightening. Of course, it was well worth it.
In what sense?
We won. Of course, the freedom that we have been able to maintain came about as a result of this. And I believe that our strong defense and our willingness to use our military services in the world has ensured that we still have our democracy.